Thank you, Nathalie, for joining us. Not sure where you are, but you're always traveling around Europe and beyond, so very good to have you for this conversation. What we were aiming for tonight, although it's not really tonight, very warm and sunny here in Barcelona, Nathalie, was to have a joint conversation on the occasion of the launch of 3 different books, which analyze from different perspectives the state of Europe and also the state of Europe vis-à-vis the rest of the world. The idea with this session was to share thoughts. So it's not a panel discussion with structured keynote speeches by any of us, but rather a conversation that we would like to keep flowing as much as possible on the future of Europe, where we stand on critical debates when it comes to internal aspects of European integration. So where are we when it comes to the political main discussions, drivers, and crises, and response to those crises that Europe is undertaking. This is part of what we want to discuss this evening, but also the external dimension. So it's very crucial time to speak about Israel and Iran. It's very timely also to still discuss Ukraine, also relations with major powers, and so on and so forth. So the idea is in this following hour or hour and so is to have a discussion on all these topics. And to do so, we have with us Hans Kundnani. He's a very well-known author and very brilliant mind on the many aspects that I've just mentioned, but also providing for a fresh perspective on all of them. And one sign of that freshness is his recent book, Eurowhiteness, which precisely analyzes the role of history, of race, of tradition, and the values that Europe has always put forward ahead of the world, and a general questioning on this so-called normative power of the European Union, or this willingness of Europe to project itself towards the outside world on the basis of its own model. That is what you will find in Eurowhiteness. Then we have with us online Nathalie Tocci, a very close friend to this institution. We've done many things together with EI, the Istituto d'Affari Internazionali in Rome, but most recently author of La Grande Incertezza. We were wondering with Hans if there's an English translation for the book, but in any case, it's a book covering the main aspects that I just mentioned as well. The role of Europe in the world. Nathalie was very much involved as advisor to 2 High Representatives, Federica Mogherini first, and then Josep Borrell, president of this institution as well, later as advisor on many aspects of Europe's external action. And in that book, she covers many of the recent crises and responses to those crises that the European Union has put forward, but most importantly, also questioning the traditional infrastructure upon which the European Union has acted as a global actor, right? And that's part of what she covers in her last book. And then finally, I have also a book. I happen to have published also a book, but it's least important than the previous 2. But it's in Spanish and Catalan on also Europe as a global actor and playing in the, what we could say in English, in the big boys' yard, right? I mean, all about geopolitics. The world is turning geopolitical. What is Europe's response ahead of that geopolitical turn? Is it even possible, given the reluctance of Europe to traditionally speak and engage with power as a concept in international affairs? I wanted to start this conversation on internal matters, right? And I'll give the first floor to Hans, because he's been writing a lot and putting very interesting thoughts on the impact of the far right and what we could call the Europe of patriots or nationalists or Eurosceptics or many different names for similar phenomenon, not only on the European integration and the future of the European Union, but also on the international position of the European Union. And I'd like him to share a few reflections first on that least studied aspect of the impact of the far right on Europe, and then I'll give the floor to Nathalie to comment on that, on which she has also written extensively. But Hans, the first floor is yours.
Thank you, Pol. It's so nice to be back in Barcelona. I think this is my first time here since the pandemic, and it's so nice to be back, especially with two of my favorite thinkers on European foreign policy, Europe in the world. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I really like this idea of sort of seeing where our three kind of books sort of intersect, where we agree and where we disagree. So my book, Eurowhiteness, is about ideas of Europe, and in particular, I sort of try to go back through history and look at the sort of interaction, the complex interaction between two different sets of ideas of Europe. On the one hand, ethnic cultural ideas of Europe, which historically have been connected to Christianity and to whiteness, and then on the other hand, civic ideas of Europe. I try to show how those ethnic cultural ideas don't just disappear after 1945, but they persist and they actually influence what becomes the European Union, the European project itself. The book came out and I should say, part of what prompted me to write it is the sense that I've had over the last 10 years since the refugee crisis in 2015. I mean, we're coming up to the 10th anniversary now of the refugee crisis. I think it's a good moment, actually, to look back on how the European Union has changed in the last decade since then. And my sense is that what's absolutely clear is the far right has been getting stronger all across Europe since then. In the first half of the 2010s, in other words, from 2010 to 2015, it seemed as if there were far-right parties that were getting stronger in northern European countries, but in southern European countries, including this one, as you know better than I do, it actually seemed as if it was left-wing radical parties that were getting stronger, obviously Podemos in Spain. Since the refugee crisis, though, whether we're talking about Italy or Spain, the far right has also, started to get stronger here too. And so I think we now have this phenomenon across Europe. And I think part of my argument in the book, but also things that I've been writing since the book came out, which was in the summer of 2023, is that I'm quite interested not just in the Eurosceptic far right, but in what you might call the pro-European far right. Because I think there's been a tendency to sort of think that the far right and the European Union are incompatible. And I think that's based on a sort of simplification of the far right and an idealization of the European Union. On the one hand, we've tended to think of the far right as being sort of inherently Eurosceptic and nationalist, so that, in other words, they're sort of incompatible with the European Union. And then conversely, I think we've tended to idealize the European Union and the history of European integration as a sort of progressive or even cosmopolitan project, right? Part of what I try to show in Eurowhiteness is that actually the history is much more complicated than this. There are these civilizational elements throughout the history of European integration. And it's precisely around this idea of Europe as a threatened civilization, it seems to me, that the EU and the centre-right, which has obviously dominated the EU since the beginning of European integration, on the one hand, and the far right, on the other hand, kind of converge. They converge around this idea that Europe is a civilization that is being threatened, whether that's by Muslim immigrants or whether that's by external powers like China. And here, for example, as I say, Macron, this European centrists who talk in this way, very pro-European, European centrists. Macron is quite explicit about this. Europe is a threatened civilization. You may have seen a few months ago the cover of The Economist. There was a big interview with Macron in The Economist. And the headline was, Europe can die, right? He's talking there not about a collapse of the European Union. He's talking about the death of European civilization, right? And as I say, this brings him, I think, actually quite close to far-right thinking. So, as I say, I've started to think about the possibility which we, until recently, saw as being almost a contradiction in terms, which is that it is possible that you could have a far-right EU, right? As the far right gets stronger, it doesn't automatically mean that the EU breaks up. the far right can take over the EU, and the centre right can help them do that by, as I said, kind of meeting them halfway, especially on these questions around identity and immigration and Islam. Mm-hmm. And here, I think, and this maybe sort of leads us directly to Nathalie, I think the paradigmatic figure here is Giorgia Meloni, because what's been very striking to me about Giorgia Meloni is that although her party goes back to the original fascist party, the Italian fascist party, she is somebody who, unlike Viktor Orban, we thought, I think, of Viktor Orban as being the paradigmatic far-right figure for the last decade or so, going back to the refugee crisis. Orban had a very fractious relationship with the European Union. Meloni has a very, very harmonious relationship with the European Union. Mm-hmm. And when you see, for example, these images of, Meloni standing alongside Ursula von der Leyen as they agree a deal, with an authoritarian North African government where the EU is basically paying those countries to keep migrants out and actually to torture them, right? So there's an outsourcing of violence as well. That, I think, captures, in a way, the possibility of this far-right EU that might emerge, and I think we're on the way to seeing right now.
Excellent. Nathalie, what's your take on this?
I agree and I disagree. I hear myself. Can someone do something about this?
Yeah, now we can hear you. Go ahead.
No, you hear me, but I also hear myself.
Ah, you hear yourself.
Yeah. I don't know if someone... No.
Can we fix
maybe
that?
No. Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
No, now you can't hear me.
We can.
We're fine.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I can't hear you, but you hear me. That's what that's what matters. Come on. So I think I both disagree and agree with Hans. I disagree with him, and I realize I'm obviously very conditioned by the fact that here I am, actually, you were saying, asking Paul, where am I? I'm actually in Rome for a change now. And I'm Rome in my office for a change. And, I direct an institute that was founded by Piero Spinelli. And so, although I do indeed think that, the idea that Hans was mentioning, that at the heart of European integration, even at the outset, there was an element of having to do with, the protection of a white and Christian self, for lack of a better way of putting it. But I think that was not the dominant. And I think that part of that story is I wouldn't say untold, but certainly underplayed story of European integration as a means of dealing with decolonization. So I think there's an element to that. What I mean by that is, dealing with the fact that, well, if you're not going to have, sort of empires left, right, and center, you can still try and protect your greatness by, huddling together, basically. So I think there's that element of it, but I don't think that it was the dominant element of European integration. I think, fundamentally, European integration had to do with, and it was a very internal logic to integration rather than an external one, and I think it fundamentally had to do with the realization that nationalism had caused all sorts of horrible things in Europe, and the only way to turn the page was by turning the page on nationalism. And therefore, I think that in that fundamental sense, one can still say that a European Union that would be dominated by nationalist far-right forces, hypothetically even by nationalist far-left forces, but I think that's far less likely to happen. Let's say nationalist far-right forces, that is, to me, a European Union that would cease to exist. Now, where I agree with Hans is, and it may sound actually in contradiction to what I just said a second ago, is that I think that the far right has gone through a very interesting, and I may add, disturbing learning process. And so, once upon a time, the far right was in the business of exiting the European Union because it only saw the European Union as this kind of liberal and even neoliberal kind of construct, and they didn't want to have anything to do with it because they did uphold a nationalist project, which they viewed, to some extent, with good reason, as in contradiction to what they were aiming for. And then, of course, came Brexit. And Brexit, in many respects, was an unmitigated disaster. And so there was a learning effect, basically, on these far-right movements. Hans, you say that to you, Meloni epitomizes this. I actually think that Orban epitomizes this, in the sense that Orban has no intention of leaving the European Union. Orban has the intention of remaining in the European Union, squeezing it basically like a lemon, extracting as much goodies as possible, and gradually hollowing it out from within. And this is, frankly speaking, exactly the same model that Meloni's pursuing. There's no difference. Yeah, one is, the leader of a small and rather insignificant country that can maybe afford to be a little bit more obnoxious. And the other is the leader of a country that if markets basically one day wake up and decide to go for a speculative attack on Italy, given the humongous size of our debt, has to be, unless, the leader is completely stupid. And unfortunately, Meloni is not stupid. And I say unfortunately, because obviously to me, this makes her more dangerous. But the aim is the same, right? The aim is a hollowing out of the European Union. And this is why I actually think that these two things can be held, basically, right? They're not actually deep down in contradiction. So the point is, how are you going to achieve that hollowing out? And this is why I say that I think there's been a learning effect. We used to think that, given that Orban or Meloni or whatever, Le Pen for that matter, or Vox don't want to exit the European Union, this makes them more moderate, right? And this is absolute rubbish. It makes them smarter. Right? It makes them smarter to the extent that they can pursue an agenda which is a disintegration agenda, but just do so gradually over time. A couple of months ago, and I'll finish with this for this first round, I was rereading Stefan Zweig's World of Yesterday. And towards the end of that absolutely fantastic book comes I can't remember if it was the last or second to last chapter in that book, in which he's describing the rise of National Socialism, which of course doesn't happen exactly overnight, right? I mean, it happens over the course of 2 decades. And he describes it in terms of its incrementalism. And he describes it in terms of you give a dose and then you see what the reaction is. And if you have the immune system kicking in, then you kind of may want to wait a little bit and get the body to get used to it, right? And then you go for the next dose, and then you go for the next and the next, and no one really notices. I mean, it's basically the sort of boiling frog scenario. But ultimately, the frog dies, right? Ultimately, the patient is killed by the twisted doctor that keeps on giving it one dose after the next. But to do it gradually is, in my view, to do it more effectively. But the end goal is still one of disintegration. And so if you think about how is it that this is even being talked about now, and this goes, I think, to another point that he only hinted at this, which is basically the way in which not only does the far right now increasingly use language which is used by others as well, but that the others, meaning especially the center right, is increasingly normalizing the far right. So I'm not going to say anything about that second aspect, which I think is, and probably Hans is going to pick up on it, but I think interestingly, look at the way in which the far right, as I said, no longer talks about whatever, disintegration or exiting and all the rest of it. Uses phrases like bureaucratic simplification. I mean, who can be against bureaucratic simplification, especially if you're talking about Europe? And so these are terms, these are words that the centre-right can use, that the centre-left can use, I mean, the Greens, the Liberals, what have you, right? But actually, they become kind of catchphrases for disintegration, just talked about in a more politically acceptable way so that no one notices, and so that you can then continue and, give the next dose one step at a time.
Mm-hmm. Listening to you, Nathalie, and also on what you said, Hans, before, I mean, it seems to me we're discussing two different things. I'd like to bring two different aspects to the conversation. One is the discussion on nationalism and the roots of nationalism compared or in opposition to the European Union and the integration project, right? And we can understand that as, Hans, you were mentioning this, as a reviving of civilization, of race, of the Europe that can die, the Europe we used to know that can die, and that brings us closer to the far-right discourse on there are people from the outside who are coming into our societies, transforming our societies. That is one way to reviving the nationalist take on the European Union. And I agree that there's a lot to it in many far-right movements. But there's another aspect, which is the nationalism in the European Union understood as defending the nation's interests, right? And this is where Nathalie brings us to her comments to the table by saying, no, listen, these forces are articulating an alternative vision on what playing the national game means in Europe, which is basically retaking control, hollowing out Brussels institutions, not completing any of the unions that we need to complete, etc., right? But these two nationalist views on many of these European movements converge today, right? These parties have had, for the first time, I would say, the capacity to put forward an alternative idea on how to build Europe, the European Union, from this nationalist perspective. Some of them will put more emphasis onto the civilizational and identitarian sort of aspects. And the other ones will put more emphasis on what we want is funds for my country. What we want is basically to regain the powers that we wrongly gave to the European Union. But what I think is crucial for the time we're living these days is that this is a powerful mix, right? This is a powerful agenda that if you bring both dimensions together, it makes for, and this is my second comment, an appealing view to many citizens across Europe, right? And we can go to the root causes of populism and everything. Perhaps we don't need to because a lot has been written on this. But the truth is that I think we're facing a very foundational debate on the future of Europe, precisely in the eyes of many citizens, as a consequence of what I just said. Because there are certain forces that have articulated a vision on Europe that it's not the traditional one, that it's not the center-left, center-right, liberal, Greens vision on the future of European integration. They've come with a convincing idea, and by looking at the results in many member states, we can certainly say it's a convincing idea for many citizens, that there is an alternative vision for Europe, an alternative vision for European integration, which is basically the Europe of the patriots, of the nationalists, of the nations, and so on and so forth. And that's what I think it's very different today from the previous waves of Euroscepticism in Europe, I would say, prior to Brexit, mostly, right? Haider and all the discussions we had on the cordon sanitaire and all the different formulas that we invented to basically keep those at bay, right? Because they were dangerous, they were what we wanted to live outside of the political discourse. I think today it's very difficult for us to leave this other idea of Europe totally outside of the equation. Because it's very present in the results of the elections, but it's also very present, and that's my point, in the idea of Europe, in what they believe Europe should be about. And that's, I'm sorry to say, and I join you on this, Hans, this is a positive, even if I don't like it, of course, a positive political agenda. It's not an anti-agenda. It's not a negative agenda. It's not against the EU agenda, which was basically about Brexit and many other movements, right? Now I think this has changed, and I think that's why we should give credit, or at least try to tackle this fundamental question, not only the expressions of the discussion. But sorry, to add on this, I don't know. Feel free to jump in.
So can I'll get to this question of nationalism, but can I just briefly go back to the history? Because I do think it's important, and I do think that part of the reason that we're misunderstanding the present is because we're misunderstanding the history of the European Union, European integration. So, Nathalie, I mean, you sort of presented European integration as a way for European countries to deal with the loss of their empires, right? And you sort of suggested that, you know, the idea was that if we don't have colonies anymore, we have to huddle together, I think, as you put it, to sort of survive, right? But this is just historically not, at the beginning of European integration, this is not what happened. And this is not particularly my work in Eurowhiteness. This is, in particular, a book called Eurafrica by Pio Hansen and Stefan Jonsson, which shows, and this has been, until very recently, completely written out of the story of European integration, that European integration begins as a colonial project. It's not an anti-colonial project or even a post-colonial project. It's a colonial project. Part of the point of European integration in the early phase was for France and Belgium to consolidate, to integrate, if you like, their remaining vast colonies in Central and West Africa at a time when they were no longer able to maintain them on their own. Part of what they needed was an injection of West German capital. This is part of what was going on at the time of the initial phase of European integration. In my book, I call this the original sin of European integration, consciously analogizing to the role of slavery in the founding of the United States. And this brings me as well, Nathalie, to the sort of contrast you drew between the internal logic and the external logic. You were suggesting it's more an internal logic than an external logic. It's both, and they're very much connected, and this is all very clear now, as I say, from the work of Pio Hansen and Stefan Jonsson and others. The whole logic, the whole internal logic that you're describing, Nathalie, to turn the page on nationalism, as you put it, the whole logic of that is precisely that nationalism was undermining the ability of Europeans to rule over the rest of mankind. So in other words, the internal logic and the external logic are very much connected. The peace project, the idea of peace, the EU as a peace project, it's very clear that that Europeans didn't decide to stop fighting wars altogether. They just stopped fighting wars with each other, right? For example, in 1950, when Schuman makes his famous declaration, the beginning of the EU is a peace project. Robert Schuman is the French foreign minister, and France is fighting a brutal colonial war in Indochina. 7 years later, when the Treaty of Rome is signed, the next big step in European integration, France is fighting a brutal colonial war in Algeria, right? Which, as I say, makes clear that what Western Europeans have decided to do is stop fighting wars with each other. To the extent that the EU as a peace project is real, I think you have to call it a white peace. It's white countries deciding to not fight wars with each other anymore, precisely in order to, that they can continue to exercise their power in relation to the rest of the world. All of these ideas go back to the pan-European movement in the interwar period, and someone like Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi is very explicit about this. He says that his vision for European integration is in the spirit of the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, which is when European countries get together to basically regulate colonialism. So, he's not at all, and the founding fathers of the European Union, people like Adenauer and so on, they're not against colonialism, they're just against the competitive element in colonialism. That's why they hate nationalism, right? The whole argument is that we're fighting wars with each other, and that's undermining our collective power in relation to the rest of the world. So I think we have to sort of be a bit more clear-headed about the history of European integration itself. But then the flip side, as I was trying to suggest before, is also that I think it's too simple to think of the far right as just being nationalists. They're not. they're also civilizationalists. Another way of putting that is they don't just speak on behalf of the nation, they speak on behalf of Europe as well. The name that Orban's group in the European Parliament now has, the Patriots for Europe, captures this perfectly, right? They're both speaking on behalf of the nation, and they're speaking on behalf of Europe as a whole. Now, they have a different vision of Europe as a whole, but here again, I think we need to be a little bit careful, because, the idea of, Orban's idea, for example, of a Europe of nation states, of sovereign nation states, that was also the vision of, say, Charles de Gaulle. Right? So this isn't either new, nor is it exclusively a far-right vision. And that finally brings me to this last point that you made, Nathalie, about how you see Orban and Meloni, for that matter, their aim is to hollow out the European Union. I'm not sure, and I think we need to think about a different possibility. That's precisely what I'm trying to point to, that perhaps the point is not to hollow out the European Union, it's to transform it. Right? And what
into what?
Well, I think we can already see into what, because we're already moving in that direction, into something like a fortress Europe, right? So the way I think of what's happened, during the period that you were describing, Nathalie, you put it in terms of Brexit and a learning process, that was a consequence of Brexit. I think that's true to some extent, but I think there's something else. The way I think of it is, as the EU moves in the direction of the far right, which I think it very clearly has been on questions around identity and immigration and Islam since the refugee crisis, with exactly what you were saying, Nathalie, about the centre-right mainstreaming and normalising far-right rhetoric and policies on these questions. As the EU moves in that direction, the far right is becoming increasingly pro-European, because it sees that the European Union is moving precisely in the direction that it wants to go in. So, as I say, they don't need to hollow it out anymore. They just need to push it further in the direction that it's going. And so what I'm pointing to is a scenario where it's not that the rise of the far right leads to disintegration, as you put it, Nathalie. It could lead even to further integration in some areas, but it's along far right lines.
I want to bring in the Trump dimension here, because he's the big catalyzer of many of those forces, right? He's putting forward, well, he has his allies within Europe on this, and sharing many views, and particularly since Vance's speech in the Munich Security Conference, that became very clear to many of us who the friends and who the foes were, according to this project. But Nathalie, want to react on this?
Yeah. I can hear myself again now. Now I can't. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Hans, to be honest, the fact that there were certain individuals that both held an idea of European integration without, rejecting colonialism is not actually in and of itself a proof of one was a means to the other, but rather the fact that history doesn't change overnight, and so and therefore sort of political culture doesn't change overnight. So I think it would be kind of unfair to simply say, well, because these two things coexisted, then one was actually a means to the other, or subservient in other ways, in some ways to the other, rather than saying, as that Europe was turning the page on certain things, it kind of didn't do it in a neat way, right? I mean, it did it in a gradual way in which certain ideas gradually lost sway and others sort of rose. Although, I think it is a little bit too harsh the way you put it, but I do take, and this is in a sense what I was trying to say, in a sense, given that, things were happening, right? I mean, empires were being lost. There was an attempt at, in a sense, protecting European power, which kind of can be interpreted as white and Christian, through different means. I mean, I think that is absolutely correct, and I think it does, in a sense, echo the sort of Macron line of saying Europe is mortal, and so either it sticks together or it's in, to put it very diplomatically, deep shit. So I think these things are connected, but I think that simply interpreting it in the sort of white and Christian way is maybe a little bit on the harsh side. What I do, though, think, and this is another point where I agree, but only up to a point with you, Yes, I do think that, the aim of the Patriots is that of changing from within, and that may still mean having something which is called Europe. Yes, but up to a point. I think actually if you press someone like Meloni on what her vision for Europe is, she doesn't have one. So let's forget Orban for a moment, because Hungary is too small to kind of have a vision for Europe, right? So in a sense, let's give Orban a pass on this one. But, Meloni, especially maybe now with Merz, slightly different. But there was a time in which, especially after the European election, she really seemed to be the only one with some sort of political legitimacy, given that she was the only incumbent that had actually done well. She could have actually pressed for much more than she did. The reason why she didn't is that she didn't have any ideas for Europe. Other than, and this points to a point that you were making, other than getting Europe to do, the harsh migration policies, that, yes. But that kind of important or terrible as it may be, does not quite add up to having a vision for Europe or having an idea of European Union. It's really too restricted an area to basic, and everything else really does imply ceding sovereignty. And that is something that I just cannot see basically these parties wanting to do, so much so that I was struck a couple of days ago. I was in Prague at a conference and I was on a panel. I've been on panels with him before with Balázs Orbán. For those who don't know, Balázs Orbán is basically the kind of political, he's the sort of Rasputin basically of Viktor Orbán in many ways. And he literally said to me, we should be aiming for a regime change in Brussels. Now, if you're aiming for regime change, right, you're not aiming for something that kind of looks more or less like it is now. You're aiming for something which is radically different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing that bringing
I can't hear you now. I can.
Maybe I'm trying to build bridges between the two of you on the discussion, but
we do love each other very much.
but I'll try the second attempt to do that. Maybe the problem was that we wanted this unique European experience also to project itself towards the rest of the world. So what you are saying, Hans, is, no, listen, there were foundations of this that were very contradictory. What we were doing inside, we were not doing outside, right? And we were still having very double standards when it comes to what we have achieved internally over the last decades and what we have kept doing towards the rest of the world for the last few decades, starting with the 50s, as you were mentioning. Well, maybe we're reading that through today's eyes, because the problem is that we're reading this history by taking for granted the idea that the European project, the European invention, could be exported, right? And maybe not. Maybe it's just a unique experience. But our foreign policy, the motto of our foreign policy of the European Union has always been built on the normative power. The capacity to describe what is normal in the global scene. Normal according to what? Normal according to us, right? Normal regarding what we have achieved. And maybe that's the problem. Maybe we have to understand that this European project for the rest of the world, maybe we just don't believe it, or maybe it's impossible to have it elsewhere, right? And that would be some sort of, again, gap bridging exercise between what you both are saying, and it's not incompatible. It's not incompatible. Maybe we have read it wrong. And now, yes, I want to turn to today. And basically what Trump 2.0 is saying, and Vance and Musk while he was in government and so on, what they were saying and putting in front of us in our eyes was exactly that idea, or that contradiction, saying, listen, what you have believed in, what you have built on your dream, your project, it's over. It's over. We just won't pay for your security anymore. We just won't invest in your defense. You are paying huge amounts of money to your own citizens through your services. We don't. So this is over. The party is over. And now that's why we are maybe in this contradictory phase of European integration, because basically everything we've done, it's because we had very perfect conditions on which to do it, right? And because history had proven the way it had proven, because there was the US helping us, and so on and so forth. So let me bring Trump here.
Yeah.
How does Trump impact all this idea that the European project is a perfect one internally and an export or a project to be exported outside? I mean, is Trump really? Does Trump mean the end of this idea?
Yeah. Nathalie,
you want to come in first?
It does, but not because it's Trump. I think that if there was in a sense, politically sound, let's say, liberal progressive Europe. I know Hans doesn't like this, but I'm going to say this anyway. Actually, I don't think that Trumpian vision would represent a kind of game over in any shape or form.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it may be a little bit tough. It's complicated to deal with US disengagement. It's kind of, even harder to deal with US betrayal. But I don't think that it necessarily would be the end of it. I think what makes this a mortal threat, to use Macronian language and make Hans even more angry with me, is precisely the fact that there's a triangle of threats there. So you have, let's say, the Russia threat, which is the most obvious one, and we know what that looks like. But it's also the threat that, in a weird way, although it's the most explicit one, is the one that is easier for us to handle because it's so obvious, right? And of course, if you're, Lithuania or Poland, is even more obvious than if you're Spain or Italy. But we kind of get it, more or less, right? And so we're kind of doing something about it. And to be honest, it's not impossible to do something about it. Then you have the US threat, which is one notch up, I think, in terms of threat, to the extent that going back to immune systems that I was talking about earlier, our immune system is extremely low when it comes to the US, yeah? We cannot, as I said, we can deal with the US indifference. It's very hard, not impossible, but it's much, much harder to deal with the US betrayal. I'll just give you one example to give you a sense of what I mean. Just to stick to the sort of hard military side of things. I was having a conversation with a very senior person in NATO, forget European Union, and I asked him, so is there planning going on in NATO for a sort of uncoordinated, abrupt, maybe even quite radical withdrawal of US forces from Europe? And he said to me, well, no, I mean, it's not going to happen. And while I was listening to him, I said to myself, I really hope he's lying to me. I really hope that those plans are happening somewhere. And then I realized that those plans are not happening, and because they can't happen. Because you can't plan for a betrayal when sitting around the table is precisely, that actor, right? Which kind of leaves us defenseless in a way in which I don't think we are when it comes to the US. But all of this represents an existential threat because there is the third threat, which is the one that we were talking about a moment ago, right? Mm-hmm. If there wasn't this far-right thing within Europe that may be, in a sense, incited externally, but is homegrown to a large extent, then neither Trump nor Putin, frankly speaking, would represent an existential threat. They do, to the extent that there is what I would define as the reverse J.D. Vance threat, When he talks about the threat from within, is not the threat of these dangerous woke liberals, but it's the threat of precisely the forces that we were talking about earlier, which, Paul, as you were saying, do have, in a sense, a vision. It may not be a European vision, but they have a vision, as opposed to a conservative, with a small c, vision of, let's call it the old Europe, which is literally about conserving things that as they were built in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Hans, go ahead.
Yeah. So I look at this in a slightly different way, or maybe I just sort of put the emphasis in a slightly different way. So I guess the first thing I'll say is that I think what Trump is doing in terms of basically, the uncertainty he's creating about the US security guarantee to Europe, which he also did in his first term, I think it's completely legitimate. Europe is one of, if not the richest continent on Earth, and it is completely absurd that Europe basically depends on the United States for its security. And for as long as I've been in, following these questions around European security for like 15 years. And for as long as I've been doing that, this has been on the cards, right? I can remember Robert Gates, when he was US Defense Secretary in the Obama administration, giving a speech which I now teach to my students when I do courses on European security, where he basically predicted that this would happen. He said, the American public is not going to, pay for your security forever.
That de Gaulle predicted it already, right?
Exactly, right? So Europeans basically didn't do anything, and so, then, even after the first Trump administration, when Biden gets elected after that, Europeans basically just sort of think that everything's back to normal. And so I have, frankly, very little sympathy for Europeans on this. And I think, frankly, it's even a bit bizarre to think about it as a threat. The idea that, a country on which you depend for your security, saying basically now we can't afford to do that anymore, to see that as a threat seems, I think, rather strange. Now, the problem that Europe has, the basic...
I don't want to be misunderstood. I don't think that the US withdrawing from Europe and European security in itself is a threat. If it is done in a la Gates, right, or even a la Trump 1, or if it's done gradually in a coordinated way, then you may say, and you would be absolutely right, if it's done in that way, it's not going to happen, right? And in fact, it didn't happen. But what represents a threat if I tell you, oh, don't worry, I will just gradually reduce my presence in Europe, and then actually I do something very different. And I do it abruptly, and I do it, so that is the difficult thing to handle, I think.
The way to do it, okay.
I agree it's difficult, but I still think, even if it happens abruptly, especially after all the warnings, I think it's a bit strange to look at that as a threat. Now, I think the basic problem, I think the US is potentially a threat in other ways, and this is the basic problem that Europeans have, is because they depend on the United States for their security, it means that, for example, when Trump imposes tariffs, which are a threat to the European economy, I get that, actually Europeans are completely paralyzed in terms of their ability to respond to that, because the US can then, take countermeasures on the security side, right? So that's a real challenge. But frankly, it's entirely the fault of Europeans, right? And this, I think there's sometimes a tendency, and I'm not accusing Nathalie of this at all, but there's sometimes a tendency in European foreign policy debates to sort of imagine Europe as being a victim, of other powers around the world, including the United States, and I think that's wrong. Now, I'm really glad that, Nathalie, that you laid out these three threats: Russia, the US, and the far right, because what I found really bizarre about debates about European foreign policy over the last year or two, and there's been a lot of talk about, Trump-proofing Europe and so on. What I found really strange about it is how a lot of European foreign policy analysts don't talk about the far right within Europe, except perhaps Orban. Right? It's as if, the fact that there are far-right governments in other European countries, not just in, Central and Eastern European countries, but, exactly 6, in Western European countries, founding EU member states like Italy and the Netherlands, right? This somehow doesn't sort of seem to feature at all in the discussion. Mm-hmm. Or, at a minimum, people don't seem to be thinking through the strategic implications of the rise of the far right in Europe. And this is the way I see it. But as I feel like I'm the only one saying this, and when I say this, people sort of look at me blankly and don't seem to get what I'm saying. I think that, so the consensus in European foreign policy debates is it's really clear. Europe now needs to unite. It needs to spend more on defense, increase its capabilities, become more independent of the United States, perhaps even develop a European nuclear deterrent, as Macron has said he's now willing to think about. strategic autonomy, which is the term that's often used to describe that, sounds great. I mean, who would not want to become, to go from dependence to independence? But the problem is it sort of assumes that Europe is already kind of united and is an actor in international politics, which it's not. If you start from the existence of member states, nation states, then it's not going from dependence to independence. What I think strategic autonomy means, and nobody ever says this, what it means for every European country except France, and that includes Germany, is it's exchanging dependence on the United States for your security, for dependence on each other, and in particular on France. Nobody ever says this, right? That's what strategic autonomy means. And I think that even at the best of times, that's not a very attractive prospect. I mean, I don't think Central and Eastern European countries would be very, would find that very attractive even at the best of times. But here, and this brings us back to the question of the far right in Europe, at a moment when you might have a far-right French president in 2 years' time, why would you do that? Why would you exchange dependence on the United States for dependence on France? Now, we could have, I think, quite an interesting discussion about whether, from, say, a German perspective, depending on Le Pen is preferable to depending on Trump. Right? You could make a realist argument that France and Germany's, interests are more closely aligned, or you could make an argument that Le Pen is just a more reliable, president than Trump is. But that is not the debate we're having. And all of the sort of leading European foreign policy experts think it's just really obvious that this is it's a no-brainer that Europe just needs to become independent of the United States. And there are no downsides to that, and it's just a matter of, political will. As I say, I think it's not just that it's harder now to sort of get collective action at the European level because you have far-right governments in Europe, but it's also that the whole case for strategic autonomy, I think, has now completely fallen apart.
Yeah, and you said France, but Germany too. I mean, the problem is that if we apply the same recipe to defense expenditure that we've applied before in the previous crisis, some are more capable than others, and that reinforces some countries more than others, and even more so, it can lead to more fragmentation and even more duplicities and more inefficiencies in the expenditure. And I think that's also a problem why, for us, this strategic autonomy recipe is a good idea but difficult to put in practice, also because of the state of our discussion. We'll see that in The Hague. We'll see that in the next couple of days. We'll see whether we agree among Europeans, not saying with the US, among Europeans on the new threshold for defense, and I'm not sure.
Can I add one thing though on this point about duplicating capabilities? Because this is the argument that's always made, right? Why should European countries, duplicate each other's capabilities? Wouldn't it be better if we had a sort of division of labor among European countries? We could save money and we'd have the same amount of capabilities or more capabilities by spending less. There's a very good reason why there's a duplication of capabilities, which is that European countries don't trust each other, right? And they don't trust that there might be a scenario where you, as Spain or Italy or Germany or France, might want to deploy those capabilities, and then suddenly you're dependent on another member state's government that says, no, you can't deploy those capabilities because they're ours.
Yeah, but not internally, but rather what you perceive as a threat, right? I mean, it's the threat perception that varies, not because we will fight France, right?
No.
It's because our concern will be towards different places.
Yes, exactly. So, for example, let's say France wants to deploy some military capability in, whether it's in Africa or whether it's in the Indian Ocean or wherever it is. If it's relying on other European countries, they may say, well, we see that as being some, French adventurism, and we're not going to back you. Similarly, if Poland or the Baltic states had, depended on Spain for certain capabilities, they might, be skeptical that you would actually provide them when they were needed.
Do you see future to strategic autonomy, Nathalie?
I think there's a contradiction in what Hans was saying. So I agree with Hans. So in a sense, given a choice, Europeans will continue not integrating and therefore will continue on security and therefore will continue not being strategically autonomous. given what he was saying before he said this, i.e. the fact that the US is basically saying bye, and he adds, and I agree with him, and even rightly so, we will do it because there isn't that alternative. Or at least a number of countries will do it. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone will be part of this party. But let's say, for example, you are Lithuania, yeah? I mean, what are you going to do? I mean, are you going to defend yourself against Russia on your own, or even just with the Baltic countries, or even just with Poland? So obviously you would want the US to remain engaged, but given that we're in this scenario precisely because it's not up to us, it's the US that is saying bye, otherwise we would have happily continued ever after, they will have to turn to the France and Germanys of this world because there is no alternative. Now, this is why I actually think that this momentum, let's call it strategic autonomy, for the lack of a better word, does not necessarily regard every European country. It certainly doesn't regard the European Union. So I think that for reasons that have to do with A, threat perception, and B, lack of alternatives, which has to do with at least two of the three threats that I was describing earlier, we will see a critical mass which basically revolves around Baltic, Nordic, Poland, France, Germany, UK, right? Now which will move in that same direction. Now that is not exactly insignificant. We're talking about 260 million people. Now, Paul, you may be thinking, what about Spain? Nathalie may be thinking, what about Italy? What makes me think that, because Italy or Spain may actually think, well, you know what, okay, we wanted to have the US is going, but ultimately we don't really feel that threatened, and so we would really not want, certainly if I think about the way in which Meloni talks about it, we certainly don't want to have France dealing with this, right? So it could be that some countries opt out. But generally the way in which things in Europe work is that when there is a critical mass moving in a certain direction, others tend to basically jump on the train.
Mm-hmm. Listen, I want to have some time also for comments from the audience, but I wanted to bring a last dimension to our discussion, two last rounds of comments on this.
Oh, Paul, I'll have to actually go quite.
Okay.
As in now, because I've got a television
I'll ask you
program
the
in
final
15
question,
minutes.
Nathalie, which I wanted to bring, which was the article you wrote today on Iran at The Guardian, right? You said precisely the moment that the US is asking us, or it's forcing us to be more forceful on certain things in the international scene, that includes Iran and Israel, and prior to that, Gaza, is seeing more lack of vision from the European Union perspective, or lack of capacity. Bring this dimension to the table. We'll stick to the external threats, and then we will open to the audience. Go ahead, Nathalie.
I have to disconnect because, as I said, I've got a television program in 15 minutes and I have to get there. But let me just say one thing, because I'm going to go Kundnani all the way here. I am desperate. I mean, it is honestly despairing to see the way in which, not just on Gaza, where obviously I could be talking about, endlessly of how we've completely lost the plot over the last 18 months, but the point is that on Gaza, it looked like we were gradually, a genocide later, beginning to sort of, understand that maybe sanctions or moving in that direction is something that we could consider. But it's extraordinary now what's happening on Iran. Like, you read the declaration of the E3 EU on Iran that came out last night, and all of a sudden it's like, which is the nuclear state in the Middle East? Who has attacked whom? Yeah. Now, none of us like the Iranian regime, God forbid, yeah? But let's get our facts straight, because if we don't, then not only, are we, going back to the point that Hans was making right at the beginning, you need to get your history right, yeah? Otherwise, this will eventually become a history. And so if we write it wrong now, it will condition all sorts of things that will happen, not only in the present, but also in the future. But also despairing because once upon a time, we did get the balance kind of right on Iran, right? If you think about what Solana did in the very early 2000s, in the midst of a not only transatlantic rupture, but intra-European rupture, leading up to the Iraq War, he invented that E3-EU format, which eventually, 15 years later almost, or 13 years later, it began in 2002, led to the JCPOA. This was probably the most spectacular success, not very long list, of European foreign policy. And now we've just totally blown it.
Thank you,
totally
Nathalie.
blown it.
Thank you,
anyway,
Nathalie.
I really apologize for this, but I'll have to rush off.
We'll continue the conversation here. A big applause to you. Bye-bye. Hans, on the external aspects, take it from Iran or from also Ukraine, we haven't mentioned. But
extraordinary we haven't mentioned Ukraine so far.
Exactly. Right.
God, where to start? Maybe actually where Nathalie finished off talking about the JCPOA as, one of the big EU foreign policy successes, right? And I think that's right. That is the view that this was one of the few things that the EU did well in foreign policy terms. But I think it's helpful to sort of drill a bit deeper on that, because what's extraordinary about it, and this brings us back to the discussion we were just having about the transatlantic relationship, what the whole E3 approach, culminating in the JCPOA, was precisely about leveraging American power. Right? This wasn't about Europe doing something independently of the United States. The whole logic was, Europeans, the E3, were worried about the US at that time carrying out a military strike on Iran. This is shortly after the Iraq War. And the European approach was to sort of say, let's try to use economic sanctions rather than military power, very much the sort of EU way, right, leveraging economic power. So let's persuade the US to have a program of sanctions which we'll do in a coordinated way, and that was ultimately successful. But it was only successful because the EU was able to leverage American economic power, right? So, even the thing which we point to as being the biggest EU foreign policy success ultimately still rides on American power.
Yeah, but this reminds me of the not Iran, JCPOA and E3+3, but of the Middle East understood as West Bank, Gaza, and the Israel conflict, only there. Because Solana, and Nathalie mentioned Solana's initiative on that conflict was never about solving or being able from Europe to solve the issue. There were plenty of initiatives happening in Europe, that's right, but Solana used to talk about what he called the deposits of peace, right? The deposits of peace were the different things that the European Union could do to sustain a solution or to help that solution come to fruition after the big guys would have done the great work, right? And those were the United States. And this is where the Gaza EUPOL Rafah mission came in, EUPOL COPS for the reform of the Palestinian security forces. Those were the deposits that Solana was talking about. So I think that it's not that that we are putting a lot of weight onto what Europe did back in time. The thing is that we were conscious that we couldn't do everything, but we could be complementary to what the United States was meant to do. The thing is that today we cannot complement the United States because we're on different positions.
Well, I think that's right, but I think that strategy died actually a long time ago.
Maybe.
So, the way that sometimes that's put in a slightly kind of disparaging way is, Americans do the cooking and Europeans do the washing up, right? And often the way that worked was, America would do military interventions and then Europeans would provide peacekeeping troops, after the conflict itself was over. I think that strategy died in Afghanistan because that's precisely what Europeans did in Afghanistan, and it was a complete disaster. So I think long before Trump, became president, that approach was already, I think, rather discredited. But it also just falls a long way short of how, certainly of the vision of strategic autonomy, right? That's not strategic autonomy. that's, there's a British version of this.
It's complementary autonomy.
It's not even autonomy. It's I don't even know what to call it. But as a Brit, this is very familiar, right? If you think about like what Tony Blair tried to do during the Iraq War, it's essentially to accept the existence of American power, and to try to nudge the US a little bit in one direction or another. Okay. Right? And again, that strategy blew up in Blair's face over Iraq, right? And then I think the wider European version of that blew up in Afghanistan. But as I say, it's just that's not what strategic autonomy is. That's just kind of being a sort of assistant to the United States.
Listen, let me open for if there are a couple of comments. We have a few minutes left because we've been talking for an hour. It doesn't seem so, but we've been talking for an hour. So, alguna pregunta o comentari que...
Do you have any comments? Do you have any questions that you want to make?
Aquí, sisplau, aquí al mig.
Hey, Hans, can you hear me?
You mentioned that the colonial of the European countries and before, and I want to ask you, how do you think this affects the relationship of the EU with the global South still?
Yeah.
And we are really aware that you have to change a little bit the way we understand the position of this global South regarding the EU.
Great. Yeah. Thanks. Global South. I allà també, sisplau.
My question is may I suggest a stress test in your ideas against the case of Turkey? Because Turkey is a case that they are candidates to become members since the 90s. And then at that time they were refused. The arguments were the Copenhagen criteria and things like that, or the members of the parliament that Turkey will have because of their population. But in reality, perhaps it was more strongest ideas. And if you think now, after all these 30 years, what would have been the role of the European Union with the Turkey inside in the case of the Arab Springs or the Near East, or even Armenia against Azerbaijan and so on. In reality, it was not this idea of security or the power of the European Union, but it was perhaps more a civilization issue. And at that time, Erdogan was not in power. It was the pro-European, military people who were really pushing for the European Union.
Okay, so Global South, Turkey, plus enlargement, I would say, which also brings to the mix. Go ahead with those, and maybe we can have time for a second round.
So, thank you for the question about the Global South, and this allows me to come back to the discussion that Nathalie and I were having, because Nathalie was kind of suggesting that, Europeans were just a bit slow to get over their colonial past, but that, they did. And I don't think that's the right way to look at it. So, again, there's very good academic work on this that shows how EU development policy essentially sort of continues, a lot of the sort of colonial. For example, there's a fantastic book called Recycling Empire, which shows how the people who developed EU development policy were essentially French officials who previously had been colonial administrators, right? So there's a strong continuity there, and that I think raises the question of whether even after the end of formal colonialism, roughly around 1960, when I think after that you can no longer talk about the EEC, and then the EC as a formal colonial project. There's I think a really big question around whether it's kind of a neo-colonial project, and that's particularly in terms of trade and development policy towards Africa and other countries in the global South. on the Global South, I'll just add one more thing in, which is that I think what I've been very struck by, and this brings us back to Ukraine, is how in the last sort of 3 years since the war in Ukraine began, the Europeans have been sort of baffled about how countries in the Global South essentially haven't joined the West. And my impression is that there's been, a kind of, there's been a certain kind of contempt towards the Global South that's quite shocked me, actually, in the last 3 years from, European foreign policy thinkers and so on. And I'll just give you one sort of illustration of that. Shortly after the war in Ukraine began, Lithuania stopped a shipment of COVID-19 vaccines to Bangladesh, one of the poorest countries in the world, because it didn't support Ukraine in a resolution at the UN. And that, to me, just like typifies, I think, a lot of the European attitudes to the Global South in the last 3 years. Mm-hmm. And then your question on Turkey is, again, great question. And I think it's fairly clear that, you've almost, I think, answered your own question, that the reasons why the accession process with Turkey stalled, weren't ultimately to do with the political and economic reforms that, weren't happening in Turkey, but it had much more civilizational reasons for that. France and Germany, were just, opposed on principle to Turkey joining because, as you suggested, it's a large Muslim country, and that was seen as basically, that would destroy the EU. So, for example, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the former French president, who was chairing the commission, the constitutional convention that was going to be developing a constitution for the EU, ultimately rejected by French and Dutch voters in 2005, and then it became the Lisbon Treaty. But he was chairing the convention on this. And he says, while he's in that position, that it will be the death of the EU if Turkey's allowed to join. Fritz Bolkestein, who was a Dutch European commissioner, said in 2004, and this really, I think, illustrates the civilizational thinking. He said, he sort of echoed Giscard d'Estaing's comments about how this would be, this would mean the Islamization of Europe and the end of the EU. And then he added, it would mean that the liberation of Vienna in 1683 would have been in vain. Mm-hmm. Right? In other words, taking you all the way back to, the sort of medieval idea of European identity, which was synonymous with Christianity. That's in 2004.
Yeah, and in any case, the enlargement discussion, the proof of the enlargement is not in the Turkish pudding, I would say. The proof of enlargement today is on the small member states that are future supposedly member states that are waiting in line. Because for those, the efforts that have been made prior to Ukraine are huge in some of them, right? Yeah. Look at North Macedonia. It's even changed the name of the country, changed the constitution, changed many things to adapt to the bilateral issues with many EU member states, right? So even if the European Union is not able to bring in those countries, for which we've set a timeline, by the way. We've set 2030, right? The leaders have set 2030 as the timeline for their accession. And there's not much progress to be seen on that front. So I'm not even referring to Turkey, right? I'm referring to much easier countries to integrate than Turkey.
It's really interesting how in the last 3 years since the war in Ukraine began, the issue of enlargement has come back on the EU's agenda. In fact, it's now right at the top of the EU's priorities. For a decade or so, there was just no question of further enlargement. But since the war in Ukraine, it's come back. But what's very striking about it is precisely what you said, Pol, which is that obviously Ukraine, everybody's talking about this kind of rapid accession of Ukraine. Then people also talk about Moldova and Georgia and even the Western Balkans. But what's quite extraordinary is nobody ever even mentions Turkey anymore in those discussions, right? Which, again, I think shows that this new wave of enlargement now, I think, is somewhat different from the earlier wave, in the 1990s and the 2000s, which was quite open-ended. right? This is now, I call it a defensive enlargement, right? It's not, about expanding the EU ad infinitum. It's about just bringing in these countries which are understood to be civilizationally European. And so I think there's a way in which now the eastern border of the EU and of Europe is sort of hardening. All right, for most of the post-Cold War period, it's been quite blurry, right, as in the context of the enlargement to include Central and Eastern European countries. And now I think what's happened in the last 3 years since the war in Ukraine began is that border has become very clear in the minds of European leaders, that Russia is now increasingly being defined as a civilizational other, and Ukraine is, as Ursula von der Leyen said, one of us, right? So the border is being defined in a civilizational way, in a way that I didn't think it didn't used to be.
Any more questions? We'll do the last round. 1, 2, potser pots allà... Bueno, és igual. Aquí una i després allà una altra i tancarem aquí.
Molt bé, doncs.
Fine.
For your speech. I found it very interesting when you and Nathalie spoke about the far-right strategies, how they have changed from openly attacking the European Union and saying they wanted to leave the European Union or to destroy it or anything. And how now they have moved to another kind of approach, saying they want to change it and that they defend Europe, in fact, and its origin and so on. And I would like to share that I'm a local politician, a municipal politician, and I used to be to work as a lawyer and university professor. And from my present experience in the local politics, I have experienced how the far right, we have 2 people representing, for instance, the far right in the
Vox.
Town where I live. Where?
Vox?
Yes, exactly, Vox in the case of Spain.
Yeah.
We are 27 people in the local municipality, and 2 of them are from Vox. And for instance, last month when we made the institutional declaration for the Day of Europe, May 9th, I read the declaration, of course, underlining the European values and human rights and so on. And the representative from Vox, he didn't attack, following the same line you said before. He didn't attack the European Union. He said, in fact, that they represent the purest way of saying things as Europe was founded, because Europe was founded on a sovereignty respect principle, and that now these movements towards integration and federalism, in fact, are going against the origin and the pure. So they presented themselves as the purest defenders of the European principles. And of course, from a historical point of view, they have some kind of good argument on that. So of course, I had to answer in the plenary session from our municipality that we are moving forward in an aware way because we think together we are stronger and so on. And I had to underline that I think you are the ones who are against the European principles because you defend things which are against human rights, equality, and so on. So I had to move and underline other things, but if you are a citizen who is watching these meetings, you can get a bit confused. If there is no one on the other side saying, no, but this and that. So it's true at the different levels, also in the municipal level, that they are doing that.
Thanks for sharing that.
You.
Very interesting.
Very interesting.
Sí, endavant.
Thank you very much for your speech tonight. It was super interesting. My question was in relation to the triangle that Nathalie shared with us of possible threats menacing the European Union. And my question was in regards to the division, permanent division between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. You can even see in the Copenhagen criteria a while ago how the Europeanness of Eastern European nations have always depended on the considerations imposed by the West, or the West judging how European were the Eastern European nations on their embracement of neoliberal policies, the drift away from the single-party rule of communism, etc., etc. And I was trying to relate this to what you were saying about strategic dependency and how maybe for Lithuania, changing the US for France is not a good deal at all. And I just wanted to share with you, or ask more precisely about your opinion, the division between West and East. Is this something that we should take into consideration much more? Is this a real threat that could possibly break the European Union as an underlying tension that is still there and may grow alongside nationalistic and nationalist lines? Thank you.
Excellent. Last 2 words. Hans.
Yeah, so thank you for sharing that story. I think what it illustrates to me is how elastic the concept of European values is. Because European leaders throw this phrase around all the time, European values, but it can really mean anything you want it to mean. Often people will, the shorthand is, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law are European values, right? But I think you have to ask, well, why is democracy a European value? I mean, we, again, know from academic scholarship that, this idea that democracy begins in ancient Greece is not actually correct, right? This isn't a European invention in some sense. But also, the world's largest democracies now are outside of Europe. This isn't, I think this is either a universal value, which is how I think about it, or it's some exclusive European thing, which I don't think it is. But also, even if we were to accept that democracy is a European value, why is authoritarianism not a European value? I mean, I think I would argue that Europeans have a better claim to have invented fascism than democracy, actually, right? So why is that not a European value, right? So I think the whole concept is really problematic. But I think also, if you look in the last couple of years, it's really interesting because, so for example, you mentioned sovereignty, right? Associating that with Vox, right? Well, in the last 3 years since the war in Ukraine, Ursula von der Leyen talks about sovereignty as a European value, right? That's Ursula von der Leyen. So, as I say, I think we should just abandon this concept of European values. We should just say what the values are that we believe in, right? And not claim ownership of them in this way. If we believe in democracy, let's just say we believe in democracy. We don't have to say this is a European value. I don't really think that helps us. And then on the question about Western Eastern Europe, I think sometimes we might slightly exaggerate the difference between Western and Eastern Europe. So, for example, and this comes back to something we discussed earlier, I think there's somehow still a little bit of a tendency to sort of imagine that, the illiberals are in Central and Eastern Europe, Orban and so on, but not in Western Europe, whereas in reality, as we were discussing, there's far-right parties in power across Europe now. Having said that, I do think, and this makes me quite unpopular in Central and Eastern Europe when I say this, but I think it's fairly clear, and I think this is something we have to think about, not least because there is this question now about Ukraine potentially joining the European Union. I think it's fairly clear that what the accession of Central and Eastern European countries did, 2004 onwards, is it pulled the European Union to the right. On cultural questions, these questions around civilization and so on, but also on economic questions, it strengthened the bloc of economic liberal countries. And so I think if you're on the left, which I am, I think you have to be quite troubled by that. And I think that Ukraine joining the European Union will do the same thing except on an even bigger scale, not least because this is a hyper-nationalist country that is at war. I think it's going to have a similar effect, but even more so on the European Union. So, for those of you that are EU citizens, I'm not, I'm British, this is actually none of my business anymore. But if I were an EU citizen on the left, I would be quite troubled about all of this.
Except for one thing, which I think is quite important as well, which is the fight that we witnessed at the moment when Europeans discussed the free flowing of Ukrainian seeds into the market of the European Union and the big agriculture products and power that is Ukraine, the big opposition to that came from
Poland,
right? So one thing that can happen eventually with Ukraine is that when we go into the specifics of enlargement and not only on the geopolitical aspects of enlargement, which is basically where the discussion lies now or these days, these last few years, then we might be witnessing a new Turkey, right? And that would be a Turkey in the sense of the ending point of Ukraine's enlargement, right? It might not be that easy, and that is a full torpedo into the narrative that Europeans have done on Ukraine, right? Because we are very conscious that without the Americans, it will be very difficult to defend Ukraine. But we've said that we would do other things, such as enlargement. And that would be clearly a problem if we were not to do that. But also, let me reply to what Blanca was saying on the Vox argument in your city hall. It's always a question of the way you interpret history, right? Because you can fairly say that the origins of European integration are cooperation between states, fine, but you can say it's also about sharing sovereignty. You don't really need to go into the values discussion for defending Europe, but you can say, no, listening, it was pooling and sharing coal and steel and creating a supranational authority that we also created the European Union. So I agree with the fact that the intergovernmental and the member states union and the supranational will always be two sides of the same coin of European integration. I agree with that. But what Vox tends to do, or others, what they tend to do is a particular reading of European integration. It's only one side of the coin that they're looking at, because this is the side of the coin that they want to reinforce, right? And there a project. And fine, it's a project. I'm not denying the fact that it's a project, but it's a one-sided project, right? The European integration is more than that, right?
I think that's right, but I mean,
last minute, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I'm, as you can probably tell by now, quite cynical about the EU. I don't think there's a massive difference between what centrists and populists, let's say the far right, in terms of how they think about the European Union. I really don't. I think every EU member state, whether there's been a far right government in power or a centrist government in power, has always done exactly the same thing, which is you defend your sovereignty when it's in your interests to do it, when there are costs, right, of pooling sovereignty.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And you demand pooling sovereignty when you're going to get benefits. And I just think everyone has always done that in the history of European integration.
Excellent point to finish our conversation. Thank you very much, Hans.
Thank you.
For sharing your thoughts on this. Very provoking and very interesting. But interesting picture on Europe. I moltes gràcies a tots vosaltres per acompanyar-nos.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us.